Hi, welcome. This is Liz Hayes. Welcome to the La Double J Sisterhood. This audio is a quick sync up between the inner child and the inner being. Let's get started. Welcoming the inner child, welcoming the inner being, welcoming everything that matters to you, tuning to the intention of today, the intention of our work together. Dear inner child, I see you, I love you, I am aware of you. Here we go. We're going to just come into the container of the inner child and the inner being, and we're going to just run a lace up. Between the inner child and the inner being. And so let's get going. The inner child sees the inner being, and the inner being sees the inner child. The inner child is aware of the inner being, and the inner being is aware of the inner child. The inner child hears the inner being, and the inner being hears the inner child. The inner child co-creates with the inner being, and the inner being co-creates with the inner child. The inner child senses with the inner being, and the inner being senses with the inner child. The inner child directs the inner being, and the inner being directs the inner child. The inner child is happy with the inner being, and the inner being is happy with the inner child. The inner child is free with the inner being, and the inner being is free with the inner child. The inner child is curious about the inner being, and the inner being is curious about the inner child. The inner child communicates with the inner being, and the inner being communicates with the inner child. The inner child is safe with the inner being, and the inner being is safe with the inner child. The inner child is good to the inner being, and the inner being is good to the inner child. The inner child has nothing to prove to the inner being, and the inner being has nothing to prove to the inner child. And the inner child high fives the inner being, and the inner being high fives the inner child. And now you are all set to move forward with whatever you are playing with today. You are laced up, inner child and inner being.